Well, g'day, folks. Welcome to the Awaken Network podcast. I'm John Tyson, lead pastor of Church of the City in New York, and I'm joined by Chad Bohai, who is the lead pastor of Radiant Central Coast, and Sam Gibson, who leads Pray NYC in New York City. Thanks for joining us. In this podcast, we're going to be talking about prayer, revival, awakening, and what it looks like to seek God for another move of the Holy Spirit in our time. It's great to have you with us. Well, folks, welcome back to the Awaken Network podcast. It is great to have you with us. And you are in for a treat this morning because we are talking to the one and only Mark Sayers. Mark is a sort of hard to categorize pastor, thinker, revivalist, sociologist from Australia, but he is genuinely one of the most thoughtful, gifted men I've ever met. I first heard you, Mark, maybe this is in a breakout in a high school gym somewhere this is over a decade ago. And a friend of mine gave me, I think it might have even been a CD. I can't remember how long ago it was, but I remember hearing it and just thinking, oh my gosh, this bloke's in another category. So thank you so much for being with us today.
Oh, thanks for that very kind intro.
So tell us a little bit about yourself. A lot of these folks would know you, but tell us a little bit about yourself, where you are, what you do, and how long you've been doing it.
Yeah, I live in Melbourne, Australia, which is where I pastor, a church called Red, which I've been senior leader since, I think it's 2008, and also write, podcast. Yeah, that's what I tend to do.
What are you, just on a side note, I was born in Melbourne. What are you sort of seeing God do in Melbourne right now? Why Melbourne? Apart from, I hear there's a little bit of a rivalry with the growth rates of Sydney and Melbourne. Do you sense Melbourne being a key city right now?
Yeah, I think so. I think Melbourne lost a lot of people to the internal migration after COVID, but it's very much backfilling now with so many internationals and lots of people moved from India, New Zealand, Nepal. It really just had different friends visiting from the US and other places recently. It just really struck by how really sort of multi-ethnic and international it sort of feels at the moment. And we're seeing that at church as well. So I think for this region, Asia Pacific, I think it's a key place where God's doing stuff.
So good, mate. How did you become a Christian in the first place? What's sort of your conversion and your backstory?
Yeah, my dad came to faith in a family which didn't have a Christian background. So both my parents were Christian, and I sort of grew up in that. But really, sort of faith really became serious when I was around 16. When we go through a mental health crisis, and sort of really came to the end of myself, and basically started seeing a counselor. And in the midst of all of that, Jesus really became the center of my life and really turned my life around. So that was the start of it all.
Did you have a sense in that when you were being converted? There's a ministry call. Did that sort of come at once, or was that spaced apart a little bit?
No, that was spaced apart. So I originally got into advertising. I just studied at RMIT, but which is the Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology here in Melbourne. And halfway, I went on a mission trip actually to sort of a gang-affected area in Los Angeles, and weirdly in a alleyway. Sort of guy who was living amongst the poor there in a very beautiful way, challenged me, rebuked me. And at that point, I just felt like it was called to ministry. So came back, quit my course, dropped out and became a Salvation Army intern. And that's where the journey into ministry began.
I did not know that. And I love that. You're in, is it like Compton or Watts or something like that in LA?
It was a particular smaller sort of, low socioeconomic area that was sort of on to sort of a gang territory between two areas. It wasn't long before the LA riots, so it was sort of a tense period and sort of at the end of the sort of crack epidemic as well. So, yeah, it's pretty a different place for a guy from Melbourne to, but God really opened my heart, gave me a heart of compassion, I think, in that place. And yeah, he did a lot there.
Wow. You've written it. How many books have you written now, approximately?
I just finished my 9th.
Okay. And folks, if you haven't read Mark's stuff, it is absolutely top tier. Some of your earlier books, or a lot of your earlier books, were sort of on cultural analysis from a Christian perspective. Vertical Self, I think, is in my top 3 books on sort of getting a sense of identity. Um, but I think there's quite a distinct shift in emphasis from your earlier sort of cultural analysis and discipleship to what's happening in your heart right now around revival, renewal, awakening, and those sort of things. And
Mm,
that's people who write from that perspective rarely end up caring a lot about revival. It sort of, gets
mm,
overlooked or whatever. What happened in your heart the last few years that sort of facilitated that
mm,
shift and pivoted towards an emphasis on that?
mm. I read a book called Disappearing Church. That wasn't my intention to call it that. That was sort of part of the publishers and us had that conversation. And really, the heart behind that book was like, how do we sort of like in a very secularizing culture, hold on to practices where we can keep a resilient faith, which will hold on against the onslaught of secularism. And then I read another book, really just sort of Strange Days, about how strange things were getting. But I think what I didn't expect is that, in a sense, secularism began to be deconstructed. And I think 2016 there was a bit of a shock in the world as some of the stories that people expected of how the world was going to turn out didn't end out in that way. And secular culture had its own moment of doubt, which I think is growing.
Mm, mm,
And in 2017, I was preaching at one of our services. It was our 5 p.m. service filled with young adults,
mm,
and I sort of got to this point, like, man, I've done so much stuff on secularism. People are looking to me, and we've done practices and all of these kinds of things. And I don't know if it's going to turn things around. And I think,
mm,
the context here in Australia is, I travel around and there's some great churches, but most of them have predominantly older people. And we're going to have a significant reduction in the size of the church in the next 10 to 15 years. Is that faithful generation who've been there and been great are going to
mhm,
pass on to glory. Sort of just began to realize like I'd sort of come to the end of myself personally and the end of my own smarts. And, if God didn't turn up here. And so I think going back to a lot of stories I'd heard when I was younger, and reading those stories again. And yeah, I just had this real heart. Like it was at that moment God said to push into renewal. And I use the word renewal because I found it's a bit of a safer word with
yes.
people because, revival can freak a few people out or awaken or outpouring. Different countries use them a little bit different. But, realize that very much in, my city, there's a history of revival, which I wasn't aware of. And, I began to read those stories as well. So first there was sort of reading stuff overseas and then reading stuff here. And it just began to grow over time. And then I read a book, Reappearing Church, which is really me like, what if there was a revival or an outpouring, an awakening in a secular culture? And what if secular culture is burning itself out and creating
Mm.
the opportunity for revival? So, yeah, the preconditions, secularism being a precondition of renewal revival.
That was just as an outside observer, that was quite a profound shift in you personally, because you have taught at our church in New York a few times over the years, and I remember thinking, you gave a talk called "The California Self." It was just remember thinking, where's he even getting this stuff? I mean, it was like water from a different well. Um, But then the last time you spoke, I wasn't even there. I got these reports secondhand. It was you on your knees calling our church to the altar. And I asked our people, like, what happened? And I'm like, the
Mm,
presence of God came down. Like it was such a
mm,
marked shift. So
mm,
do you have any sort of words of perhaps exhortation to leaders who are still
mm,
sort of caught up in and it's not either or, obviously. I mean, like we have to have an awareness
mm,
of the moment God's placed us in for mission. Was
mm,
there could you perhaps give one or two more contours of the inner journey? Like what happened in the heart
mm,
journey that really
mm,
transformed the way you preach, your emphasis, and you teach? Was there like a
mm,
Bible verse or something that sort of hit you like a covenant promise or something? Or
mm,
what happened
mm.
internally? Maybe one or two just more insights.
Yeah, I think just a couple of things. Like I think um, I really became fascinated by Wesley, and I went to where he prayed with my wife Trudy in England in his house in the chapel, and seeing his little prayer kneeler thing,
Mm,
and this moment where I just thought, man, like near my house in Melbourne, there is a Wesleyan chapel, you know, this guy's prayer on the other side of the world reached across and sent a global revival. you know.
Mm.
And he was a guy who was writing about philosophy, the stuff he wrote where he's engaged with the culture. But at the heart of this was, this deep hunger to see God move. So I think that's one sort of that moment. But to be 100% honest, I think Trudy and I, we just went through a tremendous amount of suffering, dying to self.
Right.
And, that just continued. Like, we just got absolutely smashed. And I think in the midst of that, God really showed up. And I think, also you get, I mean, you probably experienced this too. You get to certain places, when you're younger and you're growing in ministry and your ministry is expanding, you think, oh, maybe I'll speak there one day. And then you get to these places and they're good, but it's got to be something more than this. Do you know what I mean? Like, and I think
Yes.
looking back at the great saints I remember Trudy read, the Rees Howells Intercessor book, and it was just like, said to me one day, like, man, I almost want to just go back to that, like that spirit. So I think that's a very shortened version, but, I think it was things like that which changed it. So still have a heart for, I've got a book here about the Hebridean revival, and I've got a book there about, classism in 21st century cities. So I've still got those two passions.
Yes.
And I think they work well together.
Yeah. Yeah. I think your ability to read the moment and then sort of ask God what he's doing is just exceptional. So whatever you're working on next, mate, whatever you write, I just pre-order and read. And I just would encourage everyone who's listening to go back, read the back canon that you've written, and then pick up whatever you're working on next. How have you seen this emphasis like in your church? So what's changed sort of like with your heart, your people, how we're seeing your people get a vision for this, and what sort of changes happen in your congregation?
So 2019, we've been growing as a church, and the beginning of 2020 was just significant growth for us. And, you've seen that journey. And then literally I remember just thinking, wow, we're just like, growing here. And then COVID happens like a week after, we had Joe McCama come and we did like live this cultural moment. And then 2 weeks later, Melbourne goes into lockdown, which really was 2 years. And I actually I would never say this, like I've never wanted it again, but now I look back and there's good growth and unhealthy growth. And I'm not writing off what happened as unhealthy growth completely, but you come out of that and all the momentum. So we had this sort of like initial lockdown, and there was a little bit we were trying to rebuild. Then we went back into another 7-month lockdown. People left, people you loved left, because you could get out of Melbourne if you moved into state. And then it was just like, man, how are we here? And I think, it's just this really difficult thing of like, man, we just built this thing, and then it just feels like the whole thing's been pulled down, and then you're building back again. And there's a lot of, I think stuff that came up. It's interesting. I remember talking to friends in 2020 in the US, and people talk about COVID and polarization. We didn't really have polarization, in Australia politically in the same way. It's much more sort of moderate or centrist or something. And but I think across churches in Australia, off the record, a lot of people had very similar dynamics, but it was around interpersonal conflict and stuff like that, And so, it was conflict. There was just all kinds of stuff. People just felt all over the shop, and a lot of it, I think, was just the top had been ripped off, and everything came out from underneath, and that just was a long period. But around, we just started like more and more talking about renewal, pressing into revival, just talking about it, praying. We started, similar to you guys, like patterns of prayer, and prayer became central, and it became much more focused on key things about the presence of God. But it took time. Like I just want to emphasize to people, this is not a 3-week program. This was like pouring out everything, like pain. It was painful, I'm just going to be honest. And then just before around Asbury happened, we just felt like a few things starting to happen. Asbury happened. I didn't know anyone from Asbury. Like now I've become friends with them. Like, it was really bizarre, but it was just like a flare went up in a dark sea at night. And it's like, hang on. This is what I've been praying for. This can happen. And I know you headed there. We got a text from our friend Sarah Brule, who'd flown there from Europe, and she's like, "Mark and Tree, come." And we really sort of prayed, like, should we go? And I just felt the Lord very clearly say to us, start something here. So we just said to people at our church in this afternoon slot we had nothing on, if you're hungry, just come. We have no idea what we're going to do. Like, we're just going to seek God. We did 4 of them. Nothing much happened. The first one was like lots of people turned up, thinking it was all going to happen. Not dwindled, but there was less people at the fourth one. And at the end, we got to the end of it, and it was 8:30, and then we just felt the presence of God fall in this profound way. And literally everyone just sat there, and people sat there till 10:30 at night. And literally people who you've been pastorally caring for years, who've been wanting breakthrough to happen for years, in 2 hours, their lives are completely turned around. And that just began to happen. We had times where we studied the church service and the presence of God fell, and we didn't get to the sermon, and we had a service an hour, half an hour later, and the two combined, and people are rocking up in the room, and there's people down the front praying. And so, has it been all the time? No, but it's been waves, and this just keeps happening. And our church is profoundly different. It's profoundly different, and you feel it when you preach. You feel it in worship, and I think for us the question's been like, how do you sort of live in this? Having just complete unchurched people turn up, having people have prophetic dreams who wouldn't normally have prophetic dreams. So it's sort of like this process where you see like something's happening here. We had David Thomas in the crew from Asbury come out a few weeks ago, and those services were just extraordinary. I've never been in services like that. They went for hours over time. And so we're in the midst of something, and we're discerning our way and stewarding through it. And we're experiencing it in other places in Australia. We went around Australia and met many other people having similar experiences, from everything from literally Egyptian Coptic Orthodox who are hungry for this, to Sydney Anglicans, to Hillsong, to Catholic charismatics, and it's taken me by surprise, to be really honest, because I've sort of been so looking at the world, and then there's sort of something just bubbling up here in Oz. So that's a bit of our church, bit of Australia.
That's so encouraging, mate. I think there's, just helping people understand the process of, first of all, the inner journey they have to go through. Like, God has to deal with the leader's heart, pruning, pain, surrender, sort of coming to the end of ministry methods. Then God taking the heart on a different journey, and then that beginning to flow out. There's something in there that people need to pay attention to, because a lot of times we think we're going to click our fingers and that's it. But
sorry to interrupt. I completely forgot the most important thing in that. So in the midst of we come to the end of this. God's we've gone through this really tough time, particularly with sort of conflict stuff. And I was in London. I just finished speaking in Martin Lloyd-Jones's pulpit, which was like this dream moment. And I'd read his book on revival, and I leave that, and that's when I got a call from back home, thinking that this difficult period was over. That my wife Trudy had gotten stage 4 metastatic cancer. And as I'm walking to the tube, so in the midst of this, our church went through that as well, and Trudy's cancer free. But so in the midst of all these things happening, Trudy's going through chemotherapy. So my wife, who, she's not near me, and, so I didn't mean to get emotional. Podcasting, get emotional. The winnowing that happens is real. But in the midst of it, just seeing God turn up. And I think part of it as well was, during that process, I was so reliant on the presence of God and the power of God. I think He just began to turn up in His mercy. So I forgot to add that really crucial bit as well. So when I say we've been through really hard yards, that's been part of it. But God's just turned up powerfully.
What so if people want to know more about you, sort of what are you working on now? Where can they find you online? How are you sort of working towards seeing what God's doing in your church and around Australia? Just tell us a little bit about what you're working on and where people can find out more about you.
So we're really asking the question of, how do we steward this and steward it for the long term? I think we're at the beginning of something, and I think it's not just an Australian story. We have a podcast called Rebuilders, so that's one place. But one of the most beautiful things is the emails we've gotten from all over the world, of little towns and places where God's doing something. So that's really what we're going to work on at our church. I've just finished my 9th book called Platforms to Pillars. And it's really about how do we move from just pursuing our own platforms to being pillars in the living temple that God. Pillars create space for God's presence to move. So I think there's a sort of leadership change in how we need to view the world. So that comes out early next year. So Rebuilders, that's the book. And, you'll find us trying to, as Pete Greig says, you can't make the waves, but you can surf on the waves of what God's doing. So we're just trying to surf here down under in what God's doing.
Well, everybody, I will make sure that under this podcast or connected to this episode is, do you have a personal website? Is like marksayers.com or anything? Or
.co.
Okay, I'll make sure that there's a link to your website, link to your church's website. Make sure there's a link to 24/7 Australia as well, so people can see what's happening there. And listen, on behalf of so many, just want to take a moment to say thank you. When Ephesians 4 it talks about God gives leaders, and he says the leaders are the gift of the church. And I don't say this lightly. You've had a tremendous impact on me. You're one of those people I just look at when I feel like I'm a little bit crazy, and I just realize, wow, that there is thoughtful, godly, hungry people who are leading the way in this, and it gives me courage and confidence, man. So thanks for what you do, and thanks so much for joining us for the Awaken Network podcast.
Come up here through the door that I've opened for you. I torn the veil, boldly come to my throne of mercy. Just one glance, I'll never be the same. Just one look, and everything changes.